I am so thrilled today to have my dear friend and mentor, Jack Devine, with us to discuss the real challenges facing the U.S. intelligence community. Jack Devine is president and founding partner of the Arkin Group, a leading private sector intelligence firm and crisis management firm. Prior to that, he spent 33 years at the Central Intelligence Agency and held a number of senior positions in the organization, including being the agency's top spy master running worldwide operations for the CIA. He is author of the excellent book, Good Hunting, an American Spy Master's Story, and of the forthcoming book, Spy Master's Prism, Inside the Fight Against Russian Aggression, which will be out in January of 2021. I should also add, as a little trivia note, he also was an advisor on the Showtime series Homeland. So Jack, we have so much to discuss today. I really want to start with your upcoming book. I mean, I found it so fascinating. I was telling you before that I started reading The Galleys at 9 o'clock at night. I thought I was going to read for an hour and then was basically had to turn off the lights at 2 a.m. I could have read all night. I mean, I think it is such a prescient book because one of the things that you did at the CIA was you ran the Afghan operation, which played a seminal role in ending the Cold War. And as you talk about in this book about the revival of Russia in terms of Russia's great power ambitions, you really make sort of two sort of stunning points. One of them, which you say, is that essentially Russia will be our strategic adversary, regardless of how we might want things to be. And that two, the ambition and ingenuity of the Russian intelligence services is basically should never be underestimated. That basically they are unrelenting in their focus on the United States. How this focus shifted away from Russia right after 9/11. You talk about in your book that we shifted to covering things like counter-narcotics, counterterrorism, counterproliferation, while the Russians remained focused on the United States. So if you can pick up where you left off in terms of like what happened with intelligence priorities, and now how do we close this gap?
So again, there may be a little redundancy, and I'd ask the audience to excuse me. I know we're going to talk about cyber warfare, but I think this is what's happening to us. I think some of my adversaries are deciding to play the game they take me off the air.
Yes.
No jokes, so no one takes us too seriously. But what I wanted to say is that when I remember it vividly, when the Cold War, it caught me by surprise. I really didn't think it was going to fall apart as fast as it did. But it took everybody surprised. And as I said earlier, there was a consensus in Washington. The Cold War's over. Why are we investing in the Cold War? Why are we worried about Russia? I mean, it was as crass as that. I remember Jim Woolsey, the former director. I was riding with him in the car, and he said, you know, this is, it's going to be very hard to maintain a sense of missions. And as I said, the head of the Italian service once said to me, you know, we're entering a period of pax americana, when you're it, and that's all there is in the foreign policy. So foreign policy was diminished, right? This is an area of concern and interest. And I think it remains so. And then, as you noted, Halima, counter-narcotics, counter-terrorism, counter-proliferation. But what really rocked the boat was 9/11, when the attack on the towers in New York shook America, and there was a huge investment, almost total investment, in counterterrorism. And it led to two wars, one in Afghanistan and one in Iraq, and they've continued for 20 years. And the point that I was going to make, my experience has been that when you're fighting wars, intelligence agency, military, financial people, so much is focused on the wars that there's very little left over for other targets. So our focus was narrowed, and what I would say is the Russians' focus did not narrow once Putin got into power.
Well, I wonder if you could talk a little more about Putin, because you know he is a fellow spy master, and you know you give this great line when Putin basically says there's no such thing as a KGB officer. So really, like, how does his intelligence experience, you know, being, you know, a KGB guy, former head of the FSB, the intelligence service, how does he look at the United States as a target? What are his ambitions? And if you can sort of put it into context, like how big a threat is Russia? I mean, I constantly hear in Washington people say Russia plays a weak hand well, and that really the greater threat is China. How much should we be focusing our intelligence collection efforts on Russia? And if you can also add in, like, how do we reestablish what you call Moscow rules in terms of how we deal with Russia bilaterally?
Well, Halima, this is a very meaty question you put in front of me, right? But let's start and let me try and respond to it. When you look at his background, he always wanted to be a KGB officer. He tried at 17, was rejected, went in, did well in his training, ended up in, of all places, East Germany. And I mention East Germany because in the Cold War, it was the most aggressive, anti-West intelligence service. The premier spy master in those days was Wolf, who became legendary, and actually Le Carre uses him as Carla in the book. So Putin was there in Dresden at the time Wolf was in, and it was a really dark way of looking at the world. And he was shattered when the Soviet Union fell apart, his world, his country as he saw it. And I think he was never has gotten that out of his head, and he blames the West for his dreams being smashed as a young person. But he did go to St. Petersburg, which is really important, where there he got involved in politics. And again, he used some of the skills and training one receives in intelligence services, and was a natural operator. And whether he was the bag man or the aide de camp to the mayor, he learned an awful lot about really bare knuckle Russian politics, and really committed a major accomplishment by being selected by Yeltsin as a replacement as a very young man. And the reason was, at the time, all the big powers thought he was a safe bet, a company guy, but they underestimated him. And soon enough, he was able to, and actually, when you look back on it, he consolidated his power fairly quickly, and has become, an original autocrat. He is not as powerful as some of the earlier autocrats in Russia, but he's working away at it, and he's been quite successful. But you have to go to that psychological blow to him, and he's now, his number one mission is to make, respect Russia, make it a power again. So he's tried to create, and he's actually following the old Cold War vision of Russia. And it goes back even to the czars, and that's you consolidate your power internally, you make sure the borders around you are under your influence, the countries around you are under your influence. You try to push out into the world, into places like they used to call it warm water ports in the Middle East. So now he's got a port in Syria. And as we discussed the other day, Russia is a much smaller, less significant country without Ukraine. Its GDP probably matches Spain or Italy's. So without Ukraine, it's a smaller power. So, and part of that strategy was to make it the great Russia, you need Ukraine. And that is what has moved him into taking the Crimea and the eastern part of Ukraine. And I'm sure he's working diligently, not militarily, but politically, to try and suborn the western part. He also has moved out, much like his predecessors, in meddling in places like Venezuela. But there's one thing, and this will come back later on when I know you want to ask questions about cyber warfare. But there was a fundamental strategy, and it's not hidden. It's what they call the hybrid warfare, and it really is a strategy of destabilizing the West. If you want to say what is the fundamental strategy, it isn't pro-Trump or anti-Biden, or it's really how do you destabilize, and this is a very risky card, I would say, that he's playing. How do you weaken democracies in the West? And they use cyber very effectively, and I said, we're going to come to it. I know you asked me about how the intelligence services are responding in the Moscow rules, but I want to make sure that I'm not rambling on, and I'll be glad to answer those, but I want to take a breath and make sure that you don't want to say something about what I've already said.
My follow on is in terms of just, again, like strategic priorities, because when you think about the intelligence community, it's not an infinite number of assets. Like, I think when we watch these movies, you would think that You can hire anybody you want. You get every form of technology, all the budgetary support you need. It's a finite set of resources that the intelligence community has. And so I'm just wondering, again, in terms of priority, where should Russia rank? And I want to sort of move it to, discussing China, because a number of our speakers in this series have really talked about, the great power competition with China is going to be the central foreign policy, security challenge, economic challenge for the incoming administration. So maybe we can, wrap up on Russia and then pivot to how you're thinking about China. And, also, where does cyber play a role with China as well? And I should sort of also preview that we have my colleague, Matt Hedberg, one of our lead software analysts on, and we're going to be turning to him with a question in a minute. But, Jack, if you can sort of take the issue of, again, like Russia priority and then China and great power competition, like where that's going to rank.
Let's go to a very good statistic, and that was in the Cold War, our defense budget, intelligence budget, was about 70% was devoted to Russia. So when the 2016 election tampering became an issue, there was a lot of questions about what to do about Russia. And I think Clapper, who was the head of the DNI at the time, said that they were going to start building up and start raising Russia into a higher priority. So the point is, we went from 70% down to 10%. I mean, that's how low our interest in Russia. During that time, Russia, remember, has never given, its nuclear weapons were locked into place. They didn't diminish in that. They have consolidated their political structure. They came into a more aggressive view. So I think there's two issues. When you compare China, it's a longer, bigger, deeper threat. But the Russian one is a more immediate threat, in my view, in the sense that this hybrid warfare, I don't think we're getting enough attention. I know there's a very important op-ed that was put out by George Shultz and William Barry, former Secretary of State and former Secretary of Defense, saying we need a reset with Russia, and it's these are men of deep experience. But the question on that issue is reset with whom? Because I agree, and I've felt all along we should have had a different relationship, even though they were an adversary. I was for a different type of relationship and a warming of the relationship with Russia in the post-Cold War period. But what they're missing is the fact that the Russian under Putin have developed a strategy that is very aggressive today in terms of meddling in internal issues in the United States. That is a break, as you mentioned earlier, in the Moscow rules. So they're very aggressive today, and they are getting involved in places where our interests are quite substantial, including the Ukraine. So they are on the ground actually doing more muscle work. The Chinese, it's more of a political economic issue, and I want to get to it. But I think we're underestimating, and many people, including, I could speak ill of Schultz or Perry because of my deep respect for them, but they think that Putin can be charmed and brought to the table. I mean, right now, he has to. We should seek resetting the relationship, but it has to be done from a position of strength. We have not responded. To my knowledge, we've sanctioned them and so on, but they continue. The virus is a really interesting issue. I hope our intelligence community has taken a careful look to see how they may have acquired whatever information they acquired in it. But they are very aggressive in our political and defense industry using cyber warfare as a cutting edge. So it's a very important threat, and it has more nuclear weapons that are more dangerous if the relationship ever deteriorated. I think Putin is using very effectively the old Cold War strategy. I think he's very effective, very pragmatic, but it's an old strategy. It's not a good strategy in my view, for Russia or the world. He should be looking for a reset, but us keep asking for it without making it in his interest to reset. I think it's a bit of a waste of time at this point. So I think we need to take Russia a lot more seriously than we are today. And then if you would like, I can pivot. Maybe I should just mention the Moscow rules since you've raised it twice. So if you can just put it out and you can read about the Moscow rules, and there are old Moscow rules, and then a reinvention of it in the 80s. The 80s was how do you operate in Moscow? Remember, this is a spy's view of it, and that is, how do you meet agents in the middle of a denied area? My Moscow rules that I remember when I first went into CIA in the training period was we had an understanding. It's like the Magna Carta. It's not exactly a single document, right? But the Russians and we had an understanding that we would not beat up their officers and they wouldn't beat up ours. We wouldn't counterfeit money because it would destroy, the economy of the world. So there was some understandings, and one of them was you're not going to meddle. Now there are some exceptions to it. We really didn't spend a lot of time post-Stalin trying to meddle in internal Russian affairs. And to the best of my knowledge, there was a little dabbling in their part in the 80s, as I recall. By and large, one of the rules was you don't meddle in each other's internal affairs. That has changed. And I don't really believe that there's enough focus on the seriousness of that. And we need to get back to the table in whatever format we can to reestablish those. So let me catch my breath and before we transition to China and see if there's anything that, Halima, you would like to bounce off of me.
Well, actually, I think it's a good pivot point because you talk about the Moscow rules. And I wonder, again, like, are there Beijing rules? Like, when you were at in the CIA, did you have a set of operating practices in terms of how we dealt with China? Because there's been a lot of discussion that, a number of policymakers, both administrations underestimated China, that there was a view that China's rising prosperity, its inclusion in major multilateral institutions and leadership roles would sort of make Beijing behave in a way the West wanted. And now there's a real reevaluation of that because of issues like South China Seas, what we're seeing on the border with India, the Hong Kong national security law. So if you could sort of talk about, before we're in transition to Matt Hedberg in a minute, just go through quickly, what are the operating rules in terms of Beijing?
Yeah. So let me start with, we talked about why Russia is an immediate threat. It has always been consistent over the past 20 years in promoting its interest against us very aggressively. Okay. So China, if we go back to the Cold War period, two things. Much of its activity was very localized and it had a weak economy, right? So today we're looking at a very powerful economy, a very powerful military. But if you'd also look at the intelligence business back in, the Cold War period, it really was not very effective internationally. There was had a repressive intelligence system in the country, but they really were not, great recruitments of American spies or great penetrations. They really did not. They were so defensive internationally in their embassies around the world, they didn't come out and play. The Russians came out and played, so then you ended up with mutual attempts to recruit each other. So the Chinese were pretty insular, and much of their intelligence was just running around libraries in the United States and grabbing all the documents you could possibly obtain, but they didn't have real intelligence networks. Lo and behold, the internet comes, cyber comes, and now you have the capacity to collect tremendous amounts of intelligence sitting in Beijing. So their intelligence collection capabilities are much more robust. And we've also seen that they've been aggressive in recruiting and developing sources. So the difference between the two, I think, is China is a real power. I mean, they really, they have ambitions for a while, we were concerned that their ambitions were in the South Asia and the China Sea, right? Well, today their ambitions are international. They really think, and if when I speak to my friends in the China world, they actually believe that they're destined to be the global power, Pax China, right? So I think we're looking at a real struggle for international power. This exceeds Russia's potential. In other words, they do not have the economic or power base to confront us around the world. And there's some real hot spots in Asia that I think we have to be worried about. So the bigger, longer term threat, and I think the issue that will most forefront in your audience is, what about the economic confrontation? Are the tensions going to continue? And my sense is we're on a path here of where I think our relationship with China is going to look more like the Cold War than not.
That I'm going to hand over to Matt Hedberg, one of our lead software analysts. Matt, over to you.
Sure, thanks, Halima. I'll just ask one question, but it'll be a two-part question. Jack, thanks so much for doing this. So my question is, what's the intelligence community anticipate government spending will be on cybersecurity under either a Biden presidency or a Trump administration? And secondarily, what aspects of cybersecurity spend, is most important to the intelligence community?
Now, these are big questions. Obviously, a lot of it's classified, so therefore I don't know the answer to those questions. But I think what I would say is all countries are going to be spending more money in the cyber field. And there's two aspects of it, offense and defense, right? How do you defend yourself against cyber assaults? And in the United States, our private companies are spending billions and billions of dollars trying to defend itself from commercial and national threats. And I believe this is true in our competitors as well. So I see nothing but growth in the expenditure in the cyber arena. In the intelligence field, I should just add one more thing. We're talking on the defense. On the offense side, developing capabilities to neutralize each other and and cyber capabilities has to be an equally important effort, right? You're talking, you take the word cyber and it's really warfare, and you've got to match and be able to neutralize your opposition. It really gets down in some degree. At a certain point, we're going to have cyber saturation, which is the major powers are going to have almost equal ability to neutralize their countries. And I come back to Halima. We need some new rules, whether they're the Beijing rules or the cyber rules. We need rules of the road. And, how far are we going to interfere in each other's countries using a cyber? So to me, this is the big battlefield. This is where huge amounts of money are going to be spent, whether it's 5% growth a year for the next 5 years. I can't tell you, but there will be bipartisan support for cyber defense, offense and defense. And we won't be the only ones. Every major power will be making similar allocations and a percentage. Getting cyber ground rules are going to be really hard. I mean, it's not a public document that's going to be signed. I mean, I think we have one already with China, which at the time I thought was rather meaningless. But, I think we have to have real agreements on where we are, or we are going to be going at each other in a way that'll be, there'll be a lot of brinkmanship in it. And that's when we get into dangers of miscalculations by political leaders.
I want to follow up because I love the idea of miscalculation by political leaders, the sort of unintended escalation through miscalculation. And that is something we've talked a lot about when we think about the Middle East, like what are the risks of sort of tripwires being crossed? And, Jack, we had a conversation this week about Iran and all the things that have been happening in the region. And we had the spectacular killing of Qasem Soleimani, another intelligence operative, in January. Can you talk us through, sort of how we think about Iran, but also when you think about that type of sort of targeted killing, like what are the risks of that type of decision?
Yeah, no, I think
rewards, actually. Some people like General Jones, I was with him in January as well. And General Jones said the killing of Qasem Soleimani reestablished credible deterrence. So how do you think about that?
No, I'm a supporter of the action that was taken, but let me go back one step before we get to that. And that is the issue of miscalculations, right? And this is the delicacy during the entire Cold War. We almost went to war a couple times. We talk about Cuba, but there was an incident in the 80s early on that actually led Reagan to change his more hawkish to a softer line when we almost went to war in Europe, because we were running exercises and the Russians thought we were preparing, believe it or not, we were going to make some military move. Now, we wouldn't have contemplated it. So how could they reach that conclusion? and they went to into their level, a level of alert that was approximating near nuclear exchange back in the 80s. Eventually, the military leadership realized that we were heading there. Everybody picked up the phone. Everybody backed off. And I think at that point, Reagan recognized the potential for miscalculation. But it exists everywhere. Every political international issue, there's risk for miscalculating. One of the reasons I love the intelligence business is you're supposed to lower the risk. In other words, we should have known that was just game. The Russians should have had good sources saying it was gamemanship, and we should have known that they were getting pumped up to counter. So good intelligence, but it doesn't always take you where you need to be. So miscalculations are how policymakers need to make spend a lot of time when they get to looking at issues. When you look at Soleimani, what I find interesting, when we were talking the other day about the use of force. When do you use force? What is covert action, right? And I steal from the theologians of the 13th century about when do you have a just war. You have to have an intrinsically enemy, an intrinsically evil enemy. People could argue who's an enemy. 2, have you tried all other means of resolving problems? Are you going to be successful? Because you can't use force if you think you're going to fail. It's sort of bad on my principles, and certainly those. And then the next one, minimizing the cost. And proportionality. You don't kill 50,000 people to save the life of one person. There's proportionality. So all of these things have been discussed for centuries over what's a just war. When I would sit in situations where we talk about using force and we don't have these types of theological arguments, I would add a couple other, which would be we need bipartisan support down on the Hill, and it needs to be amply funded. In other words, let's not fool around. If we're going to do it, you got to be serious about it. So if you cast it in here, every time you get to a situation like Soleimani, you have to work through your head. And again, this is my format. I'm not saying this is a school of thought. You have to work things through this. Was Soleimani really such an evil person? We had to take him out. And the point was there's a lot of blood on his hands. No one will argue the viciousness of his effort over many, many years against the U.S., right? The second question said we tried the jawbone with the enemy and so on terrorism and changing their ways, and that wasn't going anywhere. So the point was, what was the risk? And this, you and I talked once about the stinger. When it went in, there's a lot of high-level policy people. That really were opposed to it because they thought it would provoke a third world war and that the Russians would respond to it. I was on the other side, and I thought that the Russians would not respond to it. They knew full well we were behind the support to the Mujahideen, and that the stinger would go in and make a difference. It made a bigger difference than I realized, but it was calculated. But the policymakers have every reason to be in a room and talk about what the ups and downs are. On Soleimani, the question was, do you really think the Iranians are going to come full-blown at the United States, right? Because you take out Soleimani. And the proof of the pudding on the response, and I have very high respect for the ability of the Iranians. I used to be chief of Iranian operations years ago, but the Iranians are really good negotiators, and they do know how to calibrate things. So what was their response? They fired a dozen missiles. They called us ahead of time, and they made sure they weren't going to hit anything that was terribly important, and that was the end of it. Now, the putting that red line down, I thought showed tremendous resolve, and there was some things that were taking place just before then. There was a drone attack, and it looked like we were not responding. And when you don't respond, there's a miscalculation, and we can push further. And in history, what you find is that when you get the miscalculation because you don't think the other side is going to use force, and you overstep the line and do something, and all of a sudden you're hit with force. So I think in this particular case, it was necessary to do it. And we also, and I know a long way of saying this, there was a time that, we might have been able to take out bin Laden, and there was issues about, what are the risks and this, that, and the other. So, risk Miscalculation is really relative to every important decision. But if you're going to be a real leader, you've got to make that decision.
Well, I want to actually follow up on the topic of covert action, because as I mentioned in the introduction, like you're really known as like the dean of covert action. Like when I was a CIA analyst doing my training, and we were the sort of dorks of the organization, but we did a week on operations. And I remember, the teacher talking about covert action and its role in the U.S. foreign policy toolkit, and being told that there was this person, Jack Devine, who was like the greatest practitioner of covert action. And so you've been involved in some of like the biggest covert action operations, and you've written a lot about that in Good Hunting, about like when you use covert action, when you don't use covert action, like the dangers of saying it just takes a little spark. And I think about it in the context of Iran, because there's so much discussion and so many questions asked about how close is the Iranian regime to collapsing, looking at the economic trouble they're facing, the protests, like would a little spark be what a president could apply with covert action to get the desired outcome? So if you could talk about the importance of covert action as a tool, it's quite controversial, why you think it's important, and when should it actually be used?
No one's ever queued up the question as well as that. It really gets to the issues that if you're going to sit around and talk about covert action, you have to address all of those issues. Now, why I write about covert action for your audience, I would like to make the point that why I believe it is a critically important tool in policy. I'm also for making sure we understand the limitations of it, so that we do not do things foolishly without thinking through the consequences and the misjudgments. So the book is really designed in some ways, it almost takes for granted that covert action is a good thing to do. And I spend a lot of time talking about, and your phrase, all it takes is a spark, is because so many people came in the office and said, my country's falling apart, Jack, and we're going to make it a democratic state. And if you just let the match it all turn out, and I walked into the door as politely as I could and say, look, when you have the plumbing in and the circumstances on the ground, and when I have bipartisan support, and by the time they got to the door, they were terribly disappointed in me. It takes a lot more. And one of the key ingredients is the circumstances in that country. That country, its people need to want change because of some oppressive form of government. If it's not there, you really shouldn't be trying to fabricate it. It's a waste of time. To bring democracy to Afghanistan until the Afghan people want it, you can spend a lot of time and bloodshed trying to do that. So one of the limitations of covert action is that you have to find the places where it applies most effectively. So to your point, Iran today, I do think Iran is much weaker than it was a couple of years ago. And I think partly the economy is hurting and the coronavirus is taking its toll. Plus, autocratic governments run out of steam. They become, not to be flip, they become boring, to the populace. In other words, we've had enough of this. It really hasn't worked out so well. So I think they're losing market share in their own country. Having said that, it is not a place where I believe all it takes is a match to start a revolution, and we'll not then have democratic parties in Iran. So I think the same in Venezuela. There's a place that is much further down the line, and still I'm not sure the circumstances are appropriate for us to be meddling in that. We do have to make sure that Iran does not have a nuclear weapon, because I think the importance of that and how it changes the power structure in the Middle East between the Sunni and Shia world, the other countries, none of them are going to sit by and let Iran sit with a nuclear weapon just by itself. And then you have an explosive area. And so I think that has to stop. One of the important things about the Soleimani attack was, I think when the president announced it on television, I'm sure the Iranians were paying as close attention as any American to the first sentence was, Iran will not have nuclear weapons. Right now, do the Iranians believe that? I think they believe that we are not going to let them have a nuclear weapon. So there is a dynamic now of how close they can get. And then it comes a question, and I'm going to be very clear, I am not in a position to either propose in the government or to analyze it. But I would hope that the tools of covert action would be at play to limit the ability for Iran to develop a nuclear weapon, which is quite different than the regime change issue of using covert action. Now, I hope that I wasn't splitting hairs there in a way that is a bit opaque.
No, I got it, and I think it's a good setup for, I think what's the question that's on a lot of people's minds is, can you walk us through, a second term Trump? How do you think the intelligence priorities would be contrasted against a incoming Biden administration? Like, what would the relations of these White Houses be with the intelligence community? And how do you think they would set intelligence priorities? And how favorably would they look on tools like covert action?
So this is a real test of an intelligence professional. So we're going to give it a try here. So when you walk into the CIA, and you've seen it, it's engraved on the wall. It's a beautiful entranceway. Those that have been there, it's the people that designed that building were really aesthetically astute. So it says in the New Testament, you shall know the truth and it will set you free. And that is really the mantra. That's what, when you walk through the building, leave your political party card at the front door. You come in here, you better serve at the will of the president, because the president represents the will of the people through the Congress, right? So that has to be taken seriously. Honestly, and I know there's going to be, people will doubt this. Everybody I knew that walked through that door had a sense of mission, that, they're serving their country and they're going to do the best job they can. And I think that's been in the best tradition of the service. So coming to your question, I think it's important to bear that in mind, that the intelligence service will serve the president and carry out and execute his will. They're very responsive to the will of the president, and they try to carry out those demands. Now, the president is not a free hand. He must get oversight, from Congress. So my point is, people say, well, how the workforce in CIA, what is it like? Do they like Trump, don't like Trump? And it's very much like America. And most of my experience, I can't tell you, no one ever told me what party they belong to. It's just unprofessional to do that, and certainly in the ranks of CIA that I understood. But my guess, my rough Kentucky windage was 50% were Democrats and 50% were Republicans. But also I lived in a world in which there was bipartisan support internationally. So I think the reaction of the intelligence community is really very, very professional. What they like most, not what they like, what they want is to be utilized and to have a sense of purpose. So the question is, will President Trump use the intelligence community, or will President Biden? My answer will be, they don't have much of a choice, because it's not 1990 and the Cold War just didn't end. There are so many challenges that we talked about today. The intelligence community is a high ticket, high value, relatively low cost item, and both will use it. Both of them are experienced in what its capabilities. Basically, President Trump through 4 years of his term, and Senator Biden for many years in the intelligence and foreign policy committees in Congress. So I think if the president's reelected, it's not going to be Prometheus Unbound, right? But I do think he's going to worry a lot less about domestic issues. But I think he'll be playing to history. And this isn't, I'd like all presidents to play the history, because if you're looking at history, you're trying to make the best decisions that you can. And the other thing is, I think the world, presidents can change the world, but it's more likely that the world changes the capacity of a president to change. Now, with that, I want to shift to Vice President Biden. I think there's much less of a gap on foreign policy than there will be on domestic policy. I think if Biden is elected, he's going to be concentrating on the economic policies, because the aftermath of the virus and getting the economy rolling and addressing issues of how we bring everyone together is going to be very formidable. The foreign policy, and I know many people are going to cringe when I say this. The reality is the foreign policy is that they're not as far apart as you might think. And it's not because they might not want to be politically far apart. But I think there's a growing consensus around China, for example, that it's more seen more adversarially, and I don't see a kumbaya with China under a new administration. I don't see Russia changing its aggressive stand. The Democrats have staked out a new position vis-a-vis the Cold War as a strong line on Russia. I think one of the problems for the intelligence community won't be that there'll be a lessening of the demands because of the issues, or that there's going to be new targets or fewer targets. I do believe the administration will try to find more international relationships, but I think globalism is in decline. Now, I know a lot of your audience, and it's been in steady decline, and I think we're in a period, good hunting in 2013 when it was first drafted. I was saying that we're going to be looking at national states and nation states. I think that's where the action is for both of them, and they're going to have to deal with it. The problem for both of them in dealing with the intelligence community is, what is the budget going to look like when we have to put Humpty Dumpty back together again after the virus? And what happens is we're going to have budgetary cuts, okay, to make things balance. And the question is, how do you take those cuts to make the bills pay, okay? And in periods like this, everyone says, well, we're going to do very selective. We are only going to pick the soft parts and we're going to cut those, right? And in the end, it's always been my experience, it's a flat rate. Everybody takes 10%. So I would think one of the challenges for both of them will be, how do they make the finances work so that you don't start down a slope of depreciating your intelligence capabilities, despite the main issues that we've been talking about, the investments in cyber warfare. I think the challenge will be, how do you keep a robust defense and intelligence? And it doesn't matter which one is selected on this. I think there's going to be huge pressures to trim the sails, and it always has a demoralizing impact on the intelligence community and a lessening of its long-term capabilities.
Wow, that's kind of a scary prognosis, Jack. One other issue on the intelligence community, because you set up a picture, regardless if it's Trump or Biden, where you're going to have resources pulled from the intelligence community, and that poses a whole sort of risks in terms of collection, how we confront these countries. I wonder if you could talk about the other kind of thing that you've talked about in your book as a big challenge, which is sort of the militarization of intelligence. That was something you really warned about in Good Hunting. In our final moments, could you talk about why that's such an important issue and why you're so concerned about it? And then sort of more broadly, the question is sort of always, what keeps you up at night? I know it's the obvious cliche question, but considering you were the top spy master, I think a lot of people would want to know, what keeps you up at night? I mean, I know you probably sleep well, but, in the moments when you are concerned, what concerns you the most?
Right. So what keeps me up awake at night? Well, that used to be an easier subject. I used to think about, the worst thing is a nuclear exchange of some sort, right? I mean, it would knock the world on its heels. So you look at the countries where a nuclear exchange where there's a possibility of it, right? So I always said the answer was India and Pakistan, because they both have almost equal amount of nuclear weapons. They have long-standing border issues, and they've been to war 3 times since 1947 when they were created. So I always thought that that's where you could have a miscalculation, and if they got into a military situation, it could be a problem. But I would say I've moved Iran further up my list today. And if they were to go forward with the nuclear weapon, and there's more friction, I think, today around the Iran issue and how we handled it. I think we're going to have a lot of arm wrestling with Russia and China that'll resemble the Cold War. But the real challenge, where there's something that could get wildly out of hand, is Iran. So.
Push you back on the issue, because again, it was such a big part of your book where you talked about the concern about that the CIA should have the lead on certain types of operations and the Defense Department should deal with others. Can you just talk quickly about why that's important?
So going back through my own pedigree, the way the agency was structured, it had a small paramilitary unit. And then whenever you got into a military confrontation, you contracted people. And then when that event was over, they went back, but you always had paramilitary capabilities. So the intelligence community spent most of its time on major issues in terms of the major powers, Russia and China. But when you get to Vietnam, then there was a much greater investment in Vietnam, less money spent on Russia and China. The problem becomes when you have two wars that you run for almost 20 years, you're hiring. You have to hire. The more you're working war-related issues, war support, you have to hire people that know more about war fighting. You have to invest more in support for the military. So in the past 20 years, we have more and more people in the CIA that are more knowledgeable about paramilitary things, involved in it, more money invested in military types of activities in largely two countries. Our U.S. military has completely changed its own structure to have special forces as sort of your cutting edge. It used to be we send the Marines in first, and now you have 70,000 special forces. So as the world becomes more and more, as I said, nation states, the paramilitary piece is going to be less used. I think whether it's Biden or Trump, I don't see boots on the ground just about anywhere, and I see a diminished on the ground presence for the intelligence community. But yet you're left with a culture or mindset that have spent many, many years on the paramilitary side. And as I said, you can only do so many things. It changes your mindset. And if the real threat is from these other issues, then I think the intelligence community needs to spend more, as we were talking earlier, on cyber and so forth. And you need people that are more talented in that area than you need in paramilitary. It becomes a morale issue because so many people in the agency have invested their lives and career in paramilitary things when they're not going to be called on to serve. Now, it will be a key part. If you look at the Russians, they're using contractors, the Wagner Group, in a couple of different places. So whether we contract it out and how involved we are. But I can't underestimate the role that everyone has to play when wars are run. And I think running them this long at this scale has had a negative impact on what I would call the more traditional collection. This is not as a hard career. I want to be clear. This isn't as if I was sitting there saying, don't get engaged in either place. Well, I did on Afghanistan, but my point is this country, its people, this is where they rallied around that 9/11 event, and both parties have supported substantially those two efforts. So it isn't as if there was a dissenting voice about what I was describing and what would be happening to the intelligence community over the long term, and how well would we be prepared in dealing with those that didn't have these situations on their hands.
Well, Jack, we are basically running over, and because we had a technical issue, I'm going to let it run 5 more minutes. And so for like the last wrap-up question, again, we'll go to 12:05, is if you could just quickly say what you are most proud of from your career in the CIA and what gives you the most, you look back and you the most sort of regret. And again, we're bringing it home because we're just going to go to 12:05 with this. So you've got 5 minutes to answer quite a difficult question.
A lot of things in life, you never know how you get involved in the first place. I'm an accident. If you looked at my profile, matched it up to the Georgetown set of the type of people that went in the agency from the elite schools and from blue blood. I'm a blue collar guy. That I ended up in the CIA knowing so little about it is a mystery to me. Until years later, I really felt that my DNA matched, and I got lucky, and I'm proud of the fact that I got in. I would say when I look at the long arc of thing, I think the most important piece where I felt I got rubbed up along with dozens of other people that were involved, and I'm glad I played one part, was the successful covert action effort to drive the Russians out of Afghanistan. I think that was a history-changing moment, and normally in life you don't hit on that. Now, regrets, I promise you I have many, many regrets. They've all faded. I think the biggest negative thing that I was associated with, and fairness and unfairness, and making sure I put this right, is I thought the Iran-Contra affair had all the earmarks of what is bad covert action. And I learned so much as a young person, having been involved in it. Now, I'm on record saying it was a bad idea to trade missiles for hostages. But the whole process and how it was off the books and didn't follow all of the rules of the game, I think was, and whether it was regret, it wasn't within my power, so to speak, to change it. But my regret that I was involved in something that I think was really, a poorly conceived policy. And then not to miss out on Rick Ames. I knew Mr. Ames. I went through training with him, and to have met a real enemy of your own, an American who betrays his country, and to have broke bread with them leaves scar tissue. But it also raised my sensitivities about the importance of counterintelligence. So they may be a little bit different answers than you were anticipating. But I mean, I think when I think of the and that's one of the things writing the book, which I thought was very helpful, is you try to make sense out of your career. Whereas you go through ordinarily you go through life without trying to make sense out of your career. And writing a book really brings into sharp focus what was meaningful, what wasn't, and you ask yourself, should I have done this or should I have done that? And one of the questions I was concerned with in writing the book was I hard enough? Was I tough enough? So the people who were doing my research said, Jack, don't worry about it. Everybody we talked to, you were sufficiently hard and difficult with them. So I feel better because I did not want to be have been soft in the moments of challenge, because it is a really difficult business, and people have to make really tough life choices, and you want to have strong resolve.
Devine, I want to say that this was a wonderful way to close out the first part of our speakers series. We started with General Joseph Votel, and I said to him, thank you for your service. I sleep better at night because of General Votel. I have always said that about you, Jack Devine. I mean, you have done such extraordinary work on behalf of your country, work that some of it is in your wonderful book, Good Hunting, an American Spy Master Story, but there's so much about your career that people will never know what you did to keep us safe at night. So thank you for spending an hour with us. I urge everybody to read Good Hunting, and as soon as Spy Master's Prism comes out, I think people should rush to the bookstore, and I hope we can have you back to have a more in-depth discussion about that book. So thank you, Jack. And as you say, when you sign up on your cables, good hunting. And with that, we close out our session today. We will hopefully be back with more in our speaker series after the convention as we approach the November election. So thank you for tuning in today. Have a great afternoon. Goodbye.
This content is based on information available at the time it was recorded and is for informational purposes only. It is not an offer to buy or sell or a solicitation, and no recommendations are implied. It is outside the scope of this communication to consider whether it is suitable for you and your financial objectives.